So for this week's Ask Me Anything, I was asked, based on a recent article I've written for Ask Men, what are some of the things you can do in your 20s to ensure you're successful in your 30s? I wrote an article about that, but this Ask Me Anything, we're going to go into a little bit of a different take on that. Uh, in your 20s, there's a lot of things you can obviously experience. You're going to have some of your best relationships with people. You're going to probably be in your top tier for your jobs. Like you're going to be in kind of start understanding which career you want to go into, buy your first house, even perhaps start a business. There's many things you're going to experience in your 20s. And it's very important that you do experience a lot of these things because your 30s matter more than your 20s. And what I mean by that is the foundation you provide and build happens in your 20s, but the execution of all that learning really takes place in your 30s. So for me anyways, that's been the case. Everything I learned between 14 to 25 really made an impact between 27 and 32. And while, you could say, well, I started early. Most people start their business life around 18, 19, where they get their first jobs. Mine was at 14. So I was a little bit of an early boomer. But if you look at that, most people in their mid 30s is when they discover really what they want to be doing, what they should be doing, and where they want to see themselves, the following decade. So you have that decade between your 20s and the 30s, ultimately as a platform of failure. I look at everything in your 20s as the perfect time to experience and get very comfortable with failure. You have to learn what it's like to fail, fall down, and hurt yourself really bad because you still have the energy and the opportunity to stand up and still continue. You have a lot of time ahead of you, right? Like time is your friend when you're in your 20s. And so therefore, when you're in your 20s, failing is the single most important thing you need to do in order to succeed in your 30s. You need to try so many things that don't work so that you kind of know a little bit more about yourself, about what you're capable of, what you're not capable of, what you're willing to do, and also how far you're willing to go. So let's give you an example of that. You have to, for example, start a business in your 20s to know what it's like to not make any money and yet invest a lot of money. You have to, date people you don't want to be with so that you know what you really don't want to, what you don't want to marry, right, in your 30s. So these things are all part of failure. Like you have to learn how to fail till you get to know yourself enough. This is part of the reason why a lot of people getting married very young typically get divorced, because they still haven't learned themselves enough by the time they get married. So by the time they become the person they're meant to be, they're completely drifted apart and they become two completely different human beings, very different than the two people that met each other, fell in love, and so on and so forth. So if you think about your 20s, really focus on failure. And there's a couple of areas where failure matters, where you should pay very close attention to. Starting a business is a very important part of that. You should definitely get familiar with the idea of selling a product, selling a service, selling yourself, and getting to that place where you're very, very comfortable being uncomfortable at selling. Because ultimately, selling or learning to sell something on your own gives you a completely different sense than working for others, which most people have done in their 20s and typically do even in their early 30s. So it's very important that in your 20s, you learn what it's like to start and fail at businesses, regardless that you're offering a blog on the side, a service or product like some photography work, videography, or even sell cars on the side. Whatever you do, you have to learn what it's like and how hard it is to be in business. So that's one of the best things you can do in your 20s is learn that part. The other thing you need to really, really start understanding in your 20s to succeed is finance. A lot of people take that for granted. They're like, well, I don't want to become an investor. I don't want to become someone that's gonna, be making money to make money kind of thing, or I don't want to work with banks, so I don't really care. Well, there's mistake number one. You're gonna work no matter what you do between your ages of 20 to the time you die. You're gonna work around money. You're gonna work for money. You're gonna work with money. You're going to work around people who want money. You're gonna pay people. You're gonna receive money, and so on and so forth. In a world where 90% of everything we do is dictated by money, you better bet your ass that you know how money works, what it does, how it functions, how it's made, how it's lost, and getting emotionally disconnected from it in your 20s. Being focused on constantly making money makes you greedy and makes you lose focus and sight of what's important. And at the same time, focusing on not making money and not caring takes you pretty much into poor status the rest of your life. And you're constantly saying things like, well, it's not about the money and so on and so forth because you don't know how to make any. So the most important part is to understand how money functions, understand how it's made, how it's traded, understand financial markets. And very importantly, one thing that's made me very successful is my understanding of credit markets. So understand how credit markets work, like understand how money is borrowed from country to country and people to people, understand how interest rates are dictated, and understand what impacts inflation and supply and demand. These are all key things that are very, very important to your 20s. And even that you want to invest or not doesn't mean you can't understand what's going on in the stock market. There's a lot of traits to how people act or react based on their actions taken in the stock market. If you understand what's happening, then you can understand how to position yourself to succeed based on what's happening in those markets. So it's very, very important for you to kind of experience that, as well as business ownership. Regardless that it's in the term of failure or success, you should still be educated and exposed to that as well. The other final thing you should really build in your 20s is to work on your own habits. I think habits are one of the key things that we form in our early teens that, based on our lack of knowledge, tend to stay with us in our 20s and are not very good. So usually our habits that we've learned early on, in most cases, not everybody, some of us have great habits in our teens, but for most of us that are exposed to society on a continuous basis, we learn to take on these terrible habits, right? So habits like, we either start smoking, start following trends, start falling with, I got to be just as good as my friend, I got to do what they're doing, I got to get it part of this MLM, whatever it is, right? So we start growing these habits in terms of how we think about things, right? And so the number one thing you can do in your 20s is start tweaking your habit. I talk about this a lot in third circle theory. I talk about this a lot true in some of these Ask Me Anythings, but you have to be able to understand how to change and how to tweak the habits that matter so you can be very consistent in your 30s. And the habits that matter most and the things that matter most in your 20s are a few things. Your ability to stay focused and your ability to stay consistent, right? So consistency happens because nothing happens overnight and everything you're going to work on is going to take time. And therefore, the most important thing is being able to know that the more you do something, the more it's going to lead to positive results, even if the results are not immediate. So getting out of this instant gratification mode before you have a family, before you're forced to get out of it by society, is very important, because then you're going to be very, very effective, especially before you have all these obligations fall back on top of you. So being able to kind of focus on things long term and be able to keep a kind of a consistent approach to your day-to-day actions to get there is also very, very important. Being patient, for example, is one of these things that you learn not to be by the time you get to your 20s. You want everything to happen immediately. But by the time you get in your 20s, if you can tweak your patience level, if you can tweak your focus and your consistency on your efforts, then you can get very, very far. And it's very, very important for you to do that, because you're going to end up in your 30s focusing on instant gratification and never being able to catch on again and again. So I highly recommend you focus on those things. Also focus on learning the financial markets and focus on failing in business. Even if you have no business ideas, start focusing on the basis of selling a product, selling a service, doing affiliate marketing or something, just so that you get used to selling. If you have if you're consistent, you have sales skills, you understand finance, and you understand business by the time you're 30, you're going to be very successful before you're 40. So I hope you like this week's Ask Me Anything, and make sure you send us your questions for next week. Take care. This week's Ask Me Anything is actually a very interesting question, and it's a question that actually pertains to me very, very well, because it is something